The torn pages are what should terrify you. When Marilyn Monroe's black address book was finally examined after her death, investigators found something that changed everything they thought they knew about that night, in August 1962. The book was intact, leather binding still firm, most pages yellowed but readable. Frank Sinatra was there, Dean Martin, Ella Fitzgerald, Joe DiMaggio, his number written in Marilyn's careful script with a small heart in the margin. Over 50 names from Hollywood's golden age, each one a piece of her complicated life. But then they noticed it. Several pages had been carefully removed, not ripped in anger or haste, surgically extracted, as if someone knew exactly which names needed to disappear before anyone official could see them. The FBI had been building a file on Marilyn since 1955, tracking her associations with what they called politically sensitive acquaintances. When agents learned about this address book, they demanded to see it immediately, because they already suspected what those missing pages contained. Not just phone numbers, evidence, the kind that could end careers, destroy reputations, and confirm the darkest rumors about powerful men and the blonde actress who knew too much. 60 years later, those torn pages remain Hollywood's most haunting mystery. Who ripped them out? When? And what names were so dangerous that they couldn't be allowed to exist, even after Marilyn was already dead? Before we dive deeper into this mystery, if you want to uncover more hidden stories from Hollywood's golden age, please subscribe and turn on notifications. The secrets we're about to reveal have been buried for decades. The address book wasn't just one book. Marilyn Monroe carried 2 separate volumes throughout the final decade of her life, each one documenting a different era of her increasingly complicated existence. The first was a red leather diary from around 1955, when she was still rising toward superstardom, when the world knew her as the breathless blonde from Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and The 7-Year Itch. That book contained the early numbers, the studio executives who had the power to make or break her, the photographers who controlled her image, the friends from her days as Norma Jean before the transformation. But it was the second book, the black address book from 1960 to 1962, that became legendary. This wasn't just a collection of phone numbers, it was a weapon, and Marilyn knew it. In 1962, before smartphones, before digital contacts, before anything could be backed up to a cloud, a person's address book was the most intimate record of their life. Every name written in ink was a decision, a relationship acknowledged, a connection deemed important enough to preserve. For someone like Marilyn Monroe, whose every move was scrutinized by studio publicists, tabloid reporters, and increasingly by federal agents, that little black book represented something dangerous, proof of who she really spent time with when the cameras weren't watching. The book itself was small, no bigger than a woman's palm, bound in soft black leather that had worn smooth from being carried in her purse day after day. The pages were lined, meant for addresses and phone numbers, but Marilyn had developed her own system. Some names were written in full, her handwriting looping and feminine. Others were reduced to initials, and some entries weren't names at all, just symbols, numbers, abbreviations that only she could decode. Frank Sinatra appeared multiple times, not just his home number in Palm Springs, but his private jet line, the number that only his inner circle knew, the one you called when you needed to disappear for a weekend in Las Vegas or Mexico without anyone knowing. Next to Sinatra's name, Marilyn had drawn a small star. No one knows what that symbol meant. A rating system? A reminder? A warning? Peter Lawford's entries were even more detailed. His Malibu beach house number, complete with directions written in the margin about which gate to use and where to park so the paparazzi wouldn't spot your car. Lawford, the British actor who had married into the Kennedy family by wedding Patricia Kennedy, had become Marilyn's primary connection to the most powerful political dynasty in America. His name appeared with the initials PL in several places, and next to one entry, Marilyn had written something that investigators would puzzle over for years: always safe. Safe from what? Safe from whom? Joe DiMaggio was there too, his number preserved 7 years after their divorce in 1954. They had been married for only 9 months, a union that collapsed under the weight of his jealousy and her fame, but DiMaggio never stopped loving her. Everyone in Hollywood knew that. He would show up at her film sets, uninvited, watching from the shadows. He would call her late at night when she was alone and frightened, and Marilyn, despite everything, never deleted his number. Next to DiMaggio's entry, she had written 2 words that speak volumes about their twisted, enduring connection: always answers. No matter what time, no matter what crisis, DiMaggio would pick up the phone. In 1962, when Marilyn's life was spiraling toward its tragic conclusion, that reliability must have meant everything, but it was the coded entries that made this book truly dangerous. Starting around 1960, Marilyn began using a system of abbreviations and symbols that suggested she knew her privacy was being violated, that someone might find this book and use it against her. Some entries were just initials, DM, that most people assumed meant DiMaggio. That could have been Frank Sinatra or someone else entirely. AM for Arthur Miller, her intellectual ex-husband, the playwright who had loved her mind as much as her body, and then written The Misfits, a film that laid bare all her vulnerabilities. And then there were entries that no one has ever definitively decoded. A phone number with a Washington D.C. area code, listed under the single letter R. Another with only a question mark next to it. A third marked with a symbol that looked like a small house. These cryptic notations drove investigators crazy because they suggested that Marilyn had been in contact with people she felt she couldn't name, even in her private book. What the public didn't know in August 1962 was that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been watching Marilyn Monroe for 7 years. The file they compiled on her eventually grew to over 100 pages, a thick dossier that tracked her movements, her associations, her political leanings, and most importantly, her relationships with men who posed what the Bureau called national security risks. It started in 1955 when Marilyn married Arthur Miller, the celebrated playwright who had been called before the House Un-American Activities Committee to testify about his alleged communist sympathies. Miller had refused to name names, a principled stand that made him a hero to some and a traitor to others. When America's biggest sex symbol married this controversial intellectual, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover took notice. The Bureau began monitoring Marilyn's phone calls, tracking her appearances at political gatherings, noting when she attended fundraisers for liberal causes or spoke out against nuclear weapons testing. They were looking for evidence that she had been radicalized by Miller, that she might be used as a propaganda tool by communist sympathizers, or worse, that she might inadvertently leak sensitive information if she was getting close to powerful government officials. And then, around 1960, their surveillance took on a new urgency. Marilyn had been introduced to John F. Kennedy, the charismatic senator who was running for president. The introduction came through Peter Lawford at parties in Malibu and Palm Springs, where Hollywood glamour mixed with political ambition. By 1961, when Kennedy was in the White House, rumors were already circulating about a relationship between the president and the actress. The FBI's interest in Marilyn's address book became acute. They wanted to know who she was calling, who she was confiding in, and most critically, whether she was keeping any written records of her interactions with the Kennedy brothers. Because by 1962, Marilyn's relationship had become even more complicated. She had allegedly moved from involvement with President John F. Kennedy to an affair with his younger brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. If true, this was a security nightmare. Marilyn Monroe, a woman with an FBI file documenting her connections to suspected communists, was potentially intimate with the 2 most powerful men in American government, and she was keeping a detailed address book. When agents learned about the book after her death, they moved quickly. According to several accounts, FBI representatives visited Marilyn's home within hours of her body being discovered. They weren't there to investigate her death. That was the LAPD's job. They were there to secure anything that might contain sensitive information, documents, letters, diaries, and especially that black address book. What they found when they examined it has never been fully disclosed. The Bureau's official position is that Marilyn's address book contained nothing of interest to national security. But researchers who have studied the FBI files released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act found something curious. Several documents refer to materials recovered from Marilyn's home that required classification review, materials that were deemed too sensitive to be included even in the heavily redacted files eventually made public. The question that has consumed researchers, conspiracy theorists, and Hollywood historians for 60 years is simple and terrible. What names were on those missing pages? The obvious answer, the one that most people jump to immediately, is that they contained the Kennedy brothers. That Marilyn had written down their private numbers, maybe even made notes about when they called or what they discussed, and that someone, either before or after her death, made sure those entries disappeared before they could become public. The circumstantial evidence supporting this theory is substantial. We know that Peter Lawford was frantically trying to reach Marilyn on the night of August 4, 1960. We know that he called her multiple times, that she sounded strange and disoriented, and that when he finally couldn't reach her anymore, he made several more calls to people whose identities have never been confirmed. We know that in the hours between when Marilyn's body was discovered by her housekeeper around midnight and when the LAPD was finally notified at 4:25 a.m., at least 4 hours passed. 4 hours when anyone could have entered that Brentwood bungalow and removed whatever they wanted. Robert F. Kennedy himself was in Los Angeles that weekend, a fact that the Kennedy family initially denied but was later confirmed by multiple witnesses. He had been at a dinner party at Lawford's beach house on August 4th. Some witnesses claimed they saw him leave around 6 p.m. Others insisted he stayed later. A few, whose testimony has been disputed and dissected endlessly, claimed they saw the Attorney General's car parked near Marilyn's house that evening. If Robert Kennedy did visit Marilyn that night, if there was a confrontation or a conversation or even just a phone call, then the address book might have contained evidence of their relationship. His private number, notes about meetings, maybe even something more incriminating. But there's another theory, one that gets less attention but is perhaps more chilling. What if the missing pages didn't contain the Kennedys at all? What if they contained something else, someone else, a secret that was even more dangerous than a presidential affair? Marilyn Monroe moved in multiple worlds in 1962. She knew Hollywood producers who controlled billion-dollar studios. She knew mob figures who ran Las Vegas casinos and had connections to organized crime families. She knew intelligence operatives who worked in the shadows of the Cold War. She knew political fixers who specialized in making problems disappear. Any one of these connections could have been worth killing for, if Marilyn had threatened to expose them or if she had simply known too much. Consider this. Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss, was a close friend of Frank Sinatra. Giancana had connections to the CIA, who had reportedly asked for mob help in assassination plots against Fidel Castro. The mob also had dirt on the Kennedy family, dating back to Joe Kennedy's rumored bootlegging during Prohibition. If Marilyn had Giancana's number in her book, or if she had notes about meetings where Sinatra introduced her to mob figures, that information would have been explosive. It would have connected the President of the United States to organized crime through their mutual connection to Marilyn Monroe, and it would have given the mob enormous leverage over the most powerful family in America. Or consider the studio system. By 1962, Marilyn was in open warfare with 20th Century Fox. She had been fired from her last film, Something's Got to Give, for chronic lateness and unprofessional behavior. The studio was threatening to sue her for $500,000, an astronomical sum at the time. But Marilyn was threatening something worse. She was going to write a tell-all book. She had started working with editors, compiling notes, talking about her experiences in Hollywood from the time she was Norma Jean, sleeping on casting couches, being passed around by producers and executives. If her address book contained detailed records of which studio executives had exploited her, which directors had assaulted her, which powerful men had treated her as property rather than a person, that book would have destroyed careers and possibly brought down the entire studio system. The entries that remain in Marilyn's address book are fascinating not just for who's included, but for how they're annotated. Marilyn developed a personal system of symbols that has never been fully decoded. Next to some names, she drew small hearts. Next to others, stars. Some entries have question marks. A few have what looks like a warning symbol, almost like an exclamation point in a triangle. These symbols represented Marilyn's emotional state toward each person. Hearts for those she loved or trusted, stars for those she admired, question marks for relationships that were uncertain or complicated. Joe DiMaggio's entry, as mentioned, has the notation, "Always answers," but it also has something else, a date, June 1961, written in the margin. Something significant happened between them that month, something important enough for Marilyn to mark it permanently in her most private record. June 1961 was when she was filming The Misfits, her last completed movie, and when her marriage to Arthur Miller was publicly disintegrating. DiMaggio had shown up on set in Nevada, supposedly just to visit, but everyone knew he was there to remind Marilyn that he was still available, still devoted, still waiting for her to come back to him. That notation suggests that moment mattered to her, that in her chaotic life, DiMaggio's constant presence was something worth remembering. Arthur Miller's entry is even more poignant. They had divorced in 1961 after 5 years of marriage that had been passionate, intellectual, and ultimately destructive. Miller had written The Misfits specifically for Marilyn, creating a character that was supposed to showcase her dramatic abilities. Instead, the film became a nightmare. Marilyn's prescription drug addiction was spiraling out of control. She was chronically late to set, sometimes not showing up for days. Clark Gable, her co-star, reportedly said working with her was the most difficult experience of his career. Gable died of a heart attack just days after filming Wrapped, and Marilyn blamed herself, convinced that the stress she had caused contributed to his death. Miller watched his wife unravel and felt powerless to help her. By the time they divorced, they were barely speaking, and yet in 1962, months after their divorce was final, Arthur Miller's number remained in Marilyn's address book. Not crossed out, not reduced to initials, but written in full. And next to his name, a notation that breaks your heart, "Still understands." Of all the men in Marilyn's life, the ones who desired her, the ones who used her, the ones who claimed to love her, Miller was the one who had seen her as a complete person. He had read books with her, discussed philosophy and politics, encouraged her intellectual curiosity. Their marriage had failed, but that connection, that recognition of her mind as well as her body, had endured. Peter Lawford's entries are the most complex. He appears multiple times under different contexts. His home phone, his beach house, his emergency line, and once, cryptically, under just the initials PL with a Washington D.C. number. That last entry has sparked decades of speculation. Was this Lawford's direct line to the White House? Was it a number where Marilyn could reach the Kennedy brothers through him? The notation next to this mysterious entry is just one word: careful. A warning, clearly. But from whom? And about what? August 4th, 1962 started as a typical Saturday for Marilyn Monroe, which meant it was chaotic, lonely, and fueled by prescription medications. She had been fired from Something's Got to Give 2 months earlier, and despite intense negotiations, Fox Studios was still refusing to rehire her. She was essentially unemployable in Hollywood, her reputation for difficulty having finally outweighed her box office appeal. She was 36 years old, an age that in 1962 was considered past prime for a woman in Hollywood, especially one who had built her career on beauty and sexuality. She was financially desperate, facing potential bankruptcy from the studio lawsuit, and she was emotionally shattered, having recently ended whatever relationship she'd had with Robert Kennedy, who had made it clear he was not going to leave his wife. She spent the day at home in Brentwood, making phone calls. Her phone records show she called Peter Lawford multiple times. She called her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, who had been treating her for depression and anxiety. She called Joe DiMaggio's son, whom she had remained close to even after divorcing his father. And she made several calls to numbers that have never been identified. In the early evening, Dr. Greenson visited her at home. He later testified that she seemed in good spirits, that they had talked for hours, and that when he left around 7 p.m. she was fine. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was staying overnight. Everything seemed normal. But then Peter Lawford called, probably around 7:30 p.m., inviting Marilyn to a dinner party at his beach house. According to Lawford's later testimony, Marilyn's voice on that call was strange. She sounded drugged, her words slurring, her thoughts disjointed. And then she said something that horrified him: "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to Jack, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." It sounded like a suicide note delivered by phone. Lawford, panicked, tried to call her back immediately. The line was busy. He called again and again, still busy. He later claimed he wanted to go to her house, but that his manager talked him out of it, saying it would be a scandal if he was found at Marilyn Monroe's home late at night. What happened in the next few hours is one of the great mysteries of Hollywood history. At some point, Marilyn's phone went off the hook entirely. Eunice Murray, the housekeeper, later gave multiple conflicting accounts of that evening. In some versions, she checked on Marilyn around midnight and found her door locked, When Dr. Greenson finally arrived, he broke through the bedroom window because the door was locked from inside. He found Marilyn lying face down on her bed, nude, one hand clutching the telephone receiver. Empty pill bottles were on the nightstand. She was dead. But here's what makes no sense. The LAPD wasn't notified until 4:25 a.m., over 4 hours after Marilyn's body was discovered. 4 hours when, supposedly, Dr. Greenson and Eunice Murray just sat with her body doing nothing. 4 hours when anyone could have entered that house, removed whatever they wanted, and left without being detected. 4 hours that have fueled conspiracy theories for 6 decades because no one has ever adequately explained what took so long. And when police finally did arrive, they found the scene had been disturbed. Someone had cleaned up, someone had removed things, and Marilyn's address book was nowhere to be found. 60 years after Marilyn Monroe's death, those torn pages still haunt us. They represent not just missing information, but missing truth, the gaps in history where powerful people have erased evidence of their actions. In the Me Too era, we understand something that seemed less clear in 1962, that powerful men have always worked to cover up their exploitation of women, that they have always used their influence to make evidence disappear, and that women who threaten to expose them have always been in danger. Marilyn Monroe died under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. The official verdict was probable suicide by barbiturate overdose, but countless investigators have found problems with that conclusion. The amount of drugs in her system, the lack of residue in her stomach, the suspicious timeline, the cleaned-up scene, the missing evidence, it all suggests something more complicated than a simple suicide. Could those missing pages from her address book have provided answers? Could they have contained the name of whoever visited her that night, whoever made sure she wouldn't wake up? We'll never know. But what we do know is that the book that remains tells its own story. It tells us about a woman who was far more complex than her image, who maintained friendships with intellectuals and artists, who cared about civil rights and social justice, who read books and discussed philosophy. It tells us about someone who was desperately lonely, reaching out through those phone lines to people she hoped might understand her, might see beyond the performance to the frightened, fragile person underneath. And it tells us about a world, Hollywood in the early 1960s, where women were commodities, where beauty was currency, and where knowing too much could get you killed. The address book that survived, even with its missing pages, is a testament. Every name in it represents a choice Marilyn made about who mattered to her, who was worth preserving in her private record. Joe DiMaggio, who never stopped loving her, whose number she kept even when their marriage was long over, who would weep at her grave and send roses to her crypt for 20 years after her death. Arthur Miller, who had tried to save her and failed, but who had given her something she craved, intellectual respect. Frank Sinatra, who had offered her escape into his world of casual glamour and late-night excess. Peter Lawford, who had connected her to power and then, perhaps, had been unable to protect her from its consequences. And all the others, the famous names and the coded initials, the phone numbers and the symbols, each one a piece of the mosaic that was Marilyn Monroe's real life, not the manufactured image, but the complicated, troubled, brave woman who lived behind it. The torn pages will probably never be found. They're likely destroyed, burned, or shredded decades ago, their secrets gone forever. But their absence speaks volumes. Someone was afraid of what they contained. Someone thought that even after Marilyn was dead, those names, those numbers, those notations were dangerous enough to warrant destruction. That fear, that need to erase evidence, tells us everything we need to know about what probably happened to Marilyn Monroe. She knew too much, she had too much evidence, and in 1962, in a world controlled by powerful men who were used to making problems disappear, she became a problem that needed solving. Her address book, even incomplete, even violated, remains as proof that she existed as more than just an image on a screen. She was real, she connected with people, she mattered. And somewhere in those missing pages lies the truth about why she had to die.